the presentation and about the conference. When we talked with Fabio about organizing something today, we were thinking about topics which address the issues of recent crises related with the refugees movements. And we thought, though, that we wanted to take a broader perspective, so trying to understand, and this is in the title of the conference, the different challenges coming from globalizations, especially for citizens' type of rights. And I was reading these two books. One is, I think, one of the best books on social inequalities, is called The Killing Fields of Inequality by Göran Therborn, who is a sociologist at the University of Cambridge, who has been studying since a long time issues of globalization. And another one is called Evil, and it is on the big challenges from the social and cultural point of view of recent transformations in the societies and in politics. Michel Wieviorka is working at École des hautes études en sciences sociales and is the director of the Maison de Sciences de l'Homme. Still, yes. And I'm extremely grateful to both for being here today. The general ideas, as I had introduced it today, is also that in big transformations, and so in also big crises, there is always some potential for changes, and that reflecting on these changes can be extremely useful in order to lead or to drive the transformations in a certain directions. And just wanted to show you, yes, some of the pictures from which I wanted to start the presentation today, but then I had to cut it short. And they are images of the recent crisis related with refugees. Refugees arriving, being met in a very, say, negative way, protesting for entering our countries. Protests were organized by refugees themselves, but they were also organized by groups of citizens that promoted a more inclusive type of attitudes towards this crisis. And there were very unexpected type of organizations from below of this type of solidarities. Demonstrations of citizens and migrants together, asking for a different conceptions of rights. Of course, this was not the only type of reactions to the big crisis. There were also negative reactions. There were also exclusive type of reactions of people who wanted instead to pressure for keeping migrants away from Europe. The idea of the symposium is, in fact, to reflect about the type of challenges that this big movement brings in the situations in which citizenship rights are very much rooted in nationhood, so they are related with the nationalities of people, and to reflect in terms of the big challenges coming on the one hand on the socioeconomic side of it from growing inequalities, and on the other hand the cultural challenges which we face. And so how can we address this mix of opportunities and challenges, trying to make the crisis positive rather than negative for our development. And I would like to give the floor to Göran Therborn to introduce the issues of inequalities and the challenges from this side, and then I will ask Michel Wieviorka to talk about the cultural challenges coming from globalization, and then I will say something about the perspective for social movements. You come here so you can...
Yes, yeah. Can I put this on the books, yes, perhaps? In old age, I've got used to give lectures and talks standing as a kind of out of politeness to the audience, so that's why I'm. Well, first of all, I mean, I should thank Donatella and Professor Beltram for inviting me to this grand event, which has been or is a very interesting experience, and to see the splendor of Republican protocol and so on. I mean, from constitutional Scandinavian monarchies, we are not quite used to that. I'm going to talk about something which may be said to be the basic reason for the migration flows of the world which we see today, and which we have experienced in history. It's also something which is a major threat to citizenship, sort of eroding it, making it increasingly empty, and that's inequality. Now, inequality has become a preoccupation of mainstream media and mainstream organizations, at least in Western Europe and North America. It's the terrain in Eastern Europe is much harder, at least among the liberal circles, I mean, now governing Eastern Europe. But the attention to inequality has focused overwhelmingly on economic inequality and on income and wealth distribution, which certainly are very important, but which are not the whole story. And there's also a political side to this exclusive preoccupation with income and wealth, which is that it's an opinion which very easily oscillates between envy at the one hand and admiration and celebrity admiration on the other. You have all these glossy magazines, I mean, dealing with the life of the wealthy, and you have the sports journalists sort of listing the ranking of athletes, I mean, not in terms of their sports achievements, but in terms of the money they earn. So this focus on economic inequality alone, I mean, is not only theoretically a bit superficial, it also has its sort of flip side politically and ideologically and culturally. So this is the background, and what I'm going to to deal with are three aspects, basically. First, I'm going to say something about inequality in a more general sense, what it is and its different dimensions. And secondly, I will locate inequality in global history and the global present. That's why the overall title of what I'm saying is Inequalities in Globalization. And thirdly, I will deal with the dynamics of inequality, what creates it, what maintains it, and finally, of course, as part of this dynamic, how can it be transformed? So this is what you're in for. And I should say, although I'll give you some PowerPoints, they are not very fancy pictures. You shouldn't expect that. They are mainly sort of lecture notes, but may help you to remember at least a few things of what I've said and what I want to convey to you. So no, I'm not a graphic designer. I'm a social scientist. So let's start by asking the question about what inequality is. This was a question which in modern times, I mean seriously, was first raised by Amartya Sen in a lecture in the late 1980s, raising the question about inequality or what, which has been a major inspiration for me ever since, although I'm not quite a disciple of Sen, and therefore, I mean, can't extrapolate anything from what I'm saying into him. I have to take the responsibility and the blame for everything I'm saying here myself. But what I want to stress is then that inequality is a historical social construction. And that means that it's something different from a difference. A difference is given either by God or by nature, or occasionally it can be chosen, like a lifestyle. But inequality is a social construction, and is not a perennial, eternal, unchanging social construction. It's something which has developed and will develop through human history. And this social construction means that the probabilities of realizing your human capability is unequally allocated. Large number of people, I mean, are really denied the possibility of realizing their human capability. And as such, inequality was something which began to be recognized in the course of the 18th century and the Enlightenment. Before that, I mean, there were differences. There were differences between the rich and the poor, but they were given. They were not unnatural, and therefore not of much concern. So the restrictions, the restraints on realizing human capability is the main thing about inequality. It's not primarily about income or wealth or what have you. The other part of this presentation then tries to specify the dimensions of inequality. And I'm arguing, I mean, that there are three fundamental dimensions. One of them is inequality with respect to how how human lives are structured for human beings as living organisms, with a lifespan, with a capacity for feeling pain, for suffering, for pleasure, and we may call that vital inequality, which in one sense, I mean, is the most basic of the three, and which we study empirically by looking at life expectancy, mortality rates. Increasingly, we also have now the capacity to measure, at least for the rich countries, health expectancy, the number of years you can be expected to live in reasonable good health without any serious illness. Then there is something which is extremely important, but which for some historical reasons has not always been treated as part of inequality, but treated as a special problem, like racism or patriarchy or sexism. But these various isms, I mean, all refers to unequal treatment of human beings as persons, and mean an unequal structuration of autonomy or heteronomy, of freedom, of respect, of recognition. And there's a whole spectrum of fields in which this existential inequality is deployed, including, of course, ethnic minorities, in particular sort of indigenous First Nations, for instance, but also handicapped people, old people, etc. All this refers to the unequal structuration of human existence. And thirdly, we have the more familiar resource inequality, which we usually measure in terms of income or wealth, which is very handy, and it's also, we know, I mean, income and wealth also are the most convertible currencies. I mean, with money you can buy most things in the world. But resources may also include, I mean, social contacts, political power, and access to water, access to clean air, etc. So that is the basic problematic of inequality, which is much wider than even the most radical sort of mainstream economics treats it. Now, what has been the role of inequality in global history? Well, without going into any detail, I won't have time to do that, it's important to stress the devastating forces of inequality which the global expansion of European power from around 1500 unleashed on the world, with the destruction and the plundering of the Americas, killing off, I mean, most of its indigenous population, the enslaving of Africa, the deindustrialization of India, in the course of the 19th century. Deindustrialization and de-urbanization. We could say demodernization of colonial India under the British Empire, at least in the course of the 19th century. And the devastation of China, never properly colonized, but always a booty to the birds of prey, whether they were American, French, German, Japanese, British, or what have you. And another effect of this European-driven globalization was a boosting of racism worldwide from the early 19th century onwards, culminating, of course, in 1944-45. So if you sometimes wonder, I mean, or notice, I mean, that Western politicians and pundits are surprised by the resentment in the global South, you shouldn't really be surprised and so on. I mean, the global South has lots of reasons, I mean, to be very resentful of European and North American power. Let us then move on, I mean, to the post-World War II period, which in many ways, I mean, is a period of very positive experience. Because it's a world of new egalitarian forces. This is the period when decolonization starts, and it's the period of the Soviet alternative to the United States and American power, which in many parts of the world meant a support for equalization, for land reform in South Korea and Taiwan, for social policies in Western Europe and so on, out of fear of the competition with the Soviets. And also the civil rights movement and a movement in the United States, and the rights of African Americans was crucially affected, I mean, by the Cold War. Without the existence of the Soviet Union, it's inconceivable, I mean, that General Eisenhower, a rather right-wing general, not explicitly anti-racist, rather sort of slightly racist himself, although, decided, I mean, to send federal troops to the American South, to Little Rock in Arkansas, to protect African American children to their right to go to school, threatened by white lynch mobs and white lynch mobs protected by the local white police. This was also the period when the United Nations was created and grew up into a significant global organization with its conventions against racism, against the discrimination of women, with its conventions about the rights of the child, and the women's conferences from Mexico to Beijing, and the Women and Development decade, 1975 to 1985. We were a very important support of the worldwide egalitarian social movements, in particular, of course, the feminist movement. Nevertheless, I mean, this was still, as you know, I mean, a period of continued Western dominance. I mean, the world was not turned upside down, but egalitarian forces did become stronger more significant. And this meant a narrowing of the life expectancy gap in the world, a vital equalization. It meant a great positive change of existential inequality, which is now sometimes, forgotten in the recent, newly awakened critique of economic inequality. But the dismantling of institutional racism and institutional patriarchy were enormous gains, for humanity, which largely took place in the course of the 1950s, 1960s, in terms of racism and in terms of patriarchy in the 1970s and 1980s. And in 1990, the apartheid in South Africa finally crumbled. In income inequality, the process of increasing inequality between nations or parts of the world flattened out. Immediately, that India became independent, the Indian economy started to grow. It had been stagnant for 100 years or more, but after 1947, it started to grow. The same thing happened with China after 1949. So there were still inegalitarian forces on the world economy at work, but the process of continuous unequalization in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century was flattened out. And in the rich world, there was the arrival of what we may call an advanced industrial society, which meant a considerable intranational equalization of income and social rights, development of welfare state, the compression of income, the income scale or the income ladders, and a compression of the wealth distribution in countries. Well, that was the period roughly from 1950 to 1990. The internal economic equalization was confined largely, to Europe, East and West, and East Asia. It didn't really happen in Africa, Latin America. But nevertheless, it was a major equalization, which we now, can afterwards recognize the significance of. Because what has happened, after 1990, with a new surge of capitalism, has been rather different. Although we should be aware of, that there are still forces opposing these new trends, and there is one part of globalization is an increase of global awareness and global consciousness, which is challenged to some extent, through the United Nations framework, its economic and social parts, not the Security Council, of course, and through organizations like the World Social Forum. So what has happened after 1990 has been that the trend to narrowing the gap of life expectancy has been broken for two reasons. One, because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa, where a drastic decline of life expectancy in many parts of Africa, particularly in the south. And the second reason is the restoration of capitalism in the former Soviet Union, which has meant an enormous increase of mortality in Russia, the Ukraine, Kazakhstan in particular. the gains in existential equality, I think, have been largely upheld. Patriarchy, in spite of rise of religious fundamentalism, is still pretty eroded in most parts of the world. What has happened is, of course, the rise of new religious sectarianism and xenophobic mobilizations, which do have effect on existential inequality, which we see today in all the campaigns against a completely invented threat of the Islamization of Europe, for instance, which is a bit like, I mean, well, it's actually rather similar, I mean, to the pre-1945, the pre-Auschwitz idea of that Europe was threatened by Jewry and by Jewish interests and so on. Now it's Islamization, which is the main threat, but it's and between countries, I mean, equality has started to bend downwards slightly, not much, not dramatically, but nevertheless, is a historical trend break, whereas inside countries, there is almost everywhere an increase of economic inequality. If we want to understand, I mean, the dynamics of inequality, what maintains it, what changes it, and what may transform it, we should look at it from two angles. One from the angle of social systems, kind of macro-social, macroeconomic perspective, and the other one is we should look at it from the individual level and the relationship between generations, so intergenerational and interpersonal relations. Now, the systemic dynamic, I would say, is primarily political, more than economic. Although, I mean, capitalist economics certainly play a major part in economic inequality, but political power and the governing of territories and or population of territories have a decisive impact on living conditions of the population in these territories. So, I mean, if you need to get a very fast, very simple idea about what determines the level of living to a person, your best option is to look at the place where this person lives. In what country, in what territory. There are lots of exceptions to this and qualifications of this. I should say, for instance, I mean, that differences or gaps in life expectancy are surprisingly large inside countries. Even in a well-organized country like Sweden, the gap in life expectancy between the poorest and the richest municipality is the same as the national gap between Sweden and Egypt. So the state spaces are not that completely covering but nevertheless, this political dynamic is often missed out in discussions, even of, and particularly perhaps of discussions of economic inequality. And a great deal of the current recent increase in economic inequality, or income inequality, is the effect of policy changes in, by governments, which has, in most cases, radically increased economic inequality. And finally, there is, of course, also a cultural dimension to the systemic inequality of, and we have among the cultures of the world, we have hierarchic and egalitarian cultures, and we have open or closed cultures of us and them. But what I would like to stress here is the other perspective. This is something I particularly want to stress because I'm myself, by formation, a macro-sociologist and mainly been working on macro variables, I mean, most of my life, although not exclusively. But we should also look at inequality as from the perspective of the formation of individual human capability. And here, inequality studies, I mean, link up with development psychology, with medicine and genetics, and a new frontier of research which is known as epigenetics, dealing with inheritance which is not caused by genetics proper, by genes or by DNA, but are formed by what the specialists in the field call the genetic expression, the expression of the genetic side, the gene pool, which is transmitted, I mean, from parents to children. And this is one of the reasons why inequality starts before birth, with many children, primarily, of course, in the poor countries, but even in the rich countries, it's a remarkable fact that lower class mothers, for some reason, which is still not quite understood, because, I mean, it's not a question of direct physical malnutrition as it is in India or Africa, but the fact is that lower class women or lower class mothers even in rich countries tend to give birth to a larger proportion of underweight babies. And underweight babies run a lot of larger risks. They tend to develop more slowly and as children, and also may very easily be handicapped in their development, both cognitive development and in terms of other non-cognitive skills, like emotional control, for instance, important for your success in life. And we also have a strong body of evidence showing that underweight babies run a much higher risk of getting heart diseases in their 50s or early 60s. And some, at least one kind of diabetes, and perhaps also other illnesses. So here we have a socially structured, epigenetic creation of inequality, which manifests itself already in the moment of birth, or actually is built up in the process of fetal growth. And then, of course, the social differences of the capability formation accelerates in early childhood. And especially crucial are the first 3 years. And most importantly, for practical purposes and so on, is that most inequality in human capability realization, human capability formation, takes place before school age. So if we want to do something about this, intervention or public support for handicapped children from socially handicapped milieus should be undertaken at a very early stage, well before school age. Something can be done at school. So, after all, the teachers are not without influence, but it's much more difficult. And so this is one of the most important aspects of the dynamics of inequality, the unequal formation of human capability at a very early stage. And this then can be summed up in the creation of life courses of cumulated inequality, which starts with the unequal capability formation, which I just mentioned, and also includes the a problematic self-formation, formation of selves in terms of self-confidence, self-esteem, sense of control of your environment, something which needs a great deal of love, care, respect, and stimulation, something which many children are deprived of, from the time they are born. And then if we follow the life course, I look at educational opportunities, which are very much shaped by self and parental aspirations, and then thereby going back to the class structuring of the parental generation and the selves which parents of different classes of social milieu create in their children. And this then continues in the labor market and the different chances you have on the labor market, increased risks of unemployment. For instance, I've estimated that on the basis of the evidence for a large number of studies about the mortal effects of unemployment, we can estimate that in the European Union, the increase of inequality from 2008 to 2013 will lead to the premature death of something between 250,000 and 350,000 people by 2025. And the cumulated inequality is also increasingly affected by the partner market, the increasing homogamy of partner formation and of marriage, meaning that prosperous, well-educated women marry or partner with prosperous and well-educated men, and low-educated, poor or unemployed men partner up with unemployed or poor and low-educated women. In this sense, sort of doubling the not only income inequality, but also the risks of which children face growing up in this milieu. We may summarize this in these two curves of inequality, of cumulated advantages and disadvantages. The vertical axis measures the possibility of human capability realization, and the horizontal axis is the lifespan. There are a couple of things you should note of this little graph. One is that it doesn't start at Origo. There are some children, I mean, who are born with advantages. This was referred to what I said earlier about the effect of the social conditions of mothers on their babies. And low-class people usually don't have a career, so they if you get a job and so on, and once you get it, you tend to stay flat, whereas people like you or us can normally expect to make a career and so on over our life course. And then the curve, of course, I mean, ends at different points in time. Poor people die first. Finally, there is the question, I mean, what can be done about this? The inequalities, or for that matter, oppressive rules, which is also or oppressive regimes, which affect existential inequality, for instance, we can summarize rather easily and rather neatly the reason why they change. They change or are transformed when the ruling or the privileged are weakened, and when the ruled, the oppressed or the disadvantaged are strengthened. And the weakening of the one and the strengthening of the other are not just mirror images of each other, because I mean they operate through different channels. So a kind of rule or a kind of regime, say, like patriarchy, may be changed, the patriarchs may be weakened by external power shocks. It was the case with Japanese patriarchy after 1945, and with the American occupation for some contingent reasons, but nevertheless very effectively, was very pushy in changing family law and family conceptions in Japan. So there you had an external power shock. There is economic strain which may come from economic crisis, from being outcompeted, or from being undercut by economic development. Patriarchy, of course, I mean, is undercut by this agrarianization, with the decline of the importance of landed property. Today, the mainstays of patriarchy are India and sub-Saharan Africa, the two largest peasant worlds on the planet. And there may be cultural developments which are significant. Kind of a generational ideology may wane. One of the reasons for the change in Eastern Europe was, of course, that the original communist or Bolshevik ideology had more or less waned or eroded among the rulers and so on, so they gave up rather than fight for what their fathers and mothers had been fighting for a generation earlier. And the dominated or the disadvantaged, I mean, maybe strengthened by new political contacts, by new political context. Nowadays, transnational support and transnational networks have become very important. We have Slum Dwellers International, for instance, and we have international networks of indigenous peoples, which help each other and strengthen their their opposition. And there is the possibility of a systemic dialectic, which Marx found in industrial capitalism, and which we are now seeing embryonically in today's China, for instance. That industrial capitalism also means the concentration of industrial workers and increasing demands based on increasing force of these industrial workers. So we have the wage levels and wage
full of emotions. The public debate is very hot, and it is difficult to introduce a sociological or a scientific perspective in these debates because we should be very careful. Yes, of course, there are some relationship between globalization and migrations. If I say globalization exerts some important effects on migrations, of course. If I say migrations are one aspect of globalization, of course. But this is not enough. So I will try not to use too much this category of globalization and maybe also the category of migration because we need to discuss this. So it is not necessary to consider that globalization explains migration or this kind of issue, but there is something which is really important to understand. The current debate on migration, at least in our part of the world, started in the late 80s, or the 80s, early 90s. And globalization, what we call globalization, also really appeared as a key issue at the same moment. So maybe we should not connect too quickly notions, but we must also accept the idea that they appeared in the debate and get a sociological debate, more or less at the same moment in current conceptualization of these issues. Of course, migration is older. So I would like to start with remarks. The first remark is theoretical or methodological. I think that we can have two ways to deal with the idea of globalization. The first one is to say a globalization is a phenomenon and we must analyze it. It is, first of all, an economic phenomenon. It is also, and here I follow you, a cultural phenomenon. If you read, for example, Arjuna Padurai, the Indian anthropologist who is living in the United States, you understand that globalization is a cultural process and not only an economic process. So we can say that. We can say globalization is a general phenomenon dominated by economic and maybe cultural, religious also, logic. Religions are global today, of course. And a phenomenon, and we can say many things, and what was said about inequalities is part of what we could say, is connected with the difficulties of states to face the phenomenon, with inequalities, and so on. And also maybe some people say with positive aspects. Globalization is not necessarily negative. But what is more interesting from my point of view is to take global or globalization in a very different way. To use this idea of global to think globally. Not to analyze globalization, but to have a way of thinking which is global. I was a good friend of Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist who died at the beginning of this year. A close friend, I can say. And he had two or three wonderful expressions that I would like to recall today. The first one, rather old now, was when he said, we must finish with methodological nationalism. That is to say, to think only or mainly within the categories of the nation state. But this is rather known. So we must, in another vocabulary, we must think global. That is to say, in my own perspective, not only deal with world logics, but try to articulate, when we analyze some phenomenon, try to articulate world dimensions, regional dimensions, Europe, Asia, Africa, and so on, national dimensions and local dimensions. Try to articulate these different levels of analysis and not to forget or not to consider that the nation state is the only and the main level for sociological analysis. But it was not the only thing that the only interesting expression which was proposed by Ulrich Beck. Much more recently, he said, today we have to deal with the cosmopolitization of the world. And so when he said that, I said, but you mean that we are all cosmopolitan or cosmopolitic? He said, no, this is not what I mean. He did not want to accept the confusion between what he called cosmopolitization of the world and being cosmopolite. Cosmopolite means you are a citizen of the world, you are happy everywhere in the world, you can have access to consumption with different products all over the world. No, this is not what he meant. What he meant is every single person, wherever this person lives, has to consider that his or her life has a lot to do with world logics, with world issues. If there is, and this was a starting point for him, if there is a nuclear catastrophe in Chernobyl, it means something for me when I live in Pisa, because in Pisa maybe there will be some problems also. And he said, risk, generally speaking, are at the world level. So cosmopolitization for him meant I have to think my own life, where I am, in terms of world logics. I don't have a cosmopolitan life. I have to think like that. So this is very important. And I would like to add something which is very important when we discuss these kind of issues. If globalization, now seen in the first meaning, a process, a phenomenon, if globalization weakens the states, as many people say, if globalization weakens institutions, as many people think, if globalization weakens classical social movements, then what remains before new institutions appear, between new forms of state develop, before new social movements appear? This will be my conclusion. What is there before that, when everything is weakening? Just you as a person, as an individual. And so if you want to think global, this is the end of this remark, you always have to know that in front of this necessity to think global, we must also take into consideration the necessity to take into account the person, the subject, the individual. You can call this as you like it. But if I say you have to take into account the subject, for instance, then there is a risk of essentialization. The subject as something that is a nature, something that exists. So better, if you accept this idea of circulating from global analysis and the point of view of the subject, of the individual, better, on this second aspect, deal with the idea of processes of subjectivation. I am more and more a subject, and able, for instance, to participate in collective action. This is why we shall arrive at collective action, Donatella. And processes of subjectivation, but also processes of desubjectivation. If I want to understand radical Islamism, for instance, anti-Semitism, racism, and so on, it has something to do with the idea of subjectivity. But it is maybe the contrary of what we like to hear when we say, people want to be subjects of their lives. So processes of subjectivation and desubjectivation on the one hand, process and the global on the other hand. We must take all these dimensions into account. Now I would like to make a few remarks about what we call migrations. I come from France, as you can understand with my accent, and in my country, until very recently, there was only one word, immigration. Immigration. It was the only word. Then people understand that there is also to take seriously into account the fact that also French people migrate. If you visit London, in the street, people speak French, and they are not only tourists, or in Mexico City. So the French people migrate. So we cannot say only immigration. We must also say emigration. And so here we begin to enter in a new family of issues, which is that there is no one single problem or issue, but several issues. And what happens, and this is not so recent, but what people discover suddenly, apparently, all this drama in the Mediterranean Sea, and then in some countries because of refugees from the Middle East. And what happens is that we understand also that migrants, I don't say immigrant or emigrant, migrants, these people can come to my country or stay a certain time in my country for very different reasons. If you say economic reasons, it is a new vocabulary in my country. I don't know if in Italy people say economic reasons to deal with the classical forms of migration, which is not such a good way of speaking. But so economic reasons, economic migrants, yes, but also people that say I need exile, or people say that I want to be a refugee. And this is not only a problem of sociological analysis, it would not be so important. It's also a problem with law, with international treaties. If you are a refugee, you can be treated following the Geneva Convention and these kind of treaties. So we understand now, I don't want to be too precise at that state, that analytically there are different forms of what we called immigration than migration, because the phenomenon is exploding into different varieties, and maybe this explosion is morally dangerous. Why should we treat so differently an economic migrant and an exile person? Why? It's not so obvious. And in the French debate, it's very interesting to see that some people on the right side of the political spectrum and other people on the left side of the political spectrum, they both say the same thing. Let us distinguish between economic migrants and exile, refugees, and so on. Is it so fair? It has to be discussed at least. I would like to add something. Of course, when you say exile or refugees, this is not new. I belong to a very interesting institution because it's a multidisciplinary institution. So we can discuss I am a sociologist, I can discuss with historians, anthropologists, and so on. So I discussed with historians that convinced me that what I considered, because this is what I learned at school when I was very young, what I considered as invasion barbary invasions after the collapse of the Roman Empire. If you discuss with German historians, they call them, excuse my poor German accent, Völkerwanderung, which means something like people migration. And in English, the historians call for that time migration period. They don't say invasion, they say migration. So the migrations are very old phenomena, and exile, of course, is also a very old phenomenon. And if you want to introduce more and more distinctions, it is very easy. I will quote a French book, a recent French book, just to give you an image of the different vocabularies that we use or we can use when we deal with these issues. So I will use French word, but just not to speak of my country, but just as an example, I don't know how to translate all this vocabulary. In this book, which is written by Alexis Nous, a good book, La condition exilique, the condition of exiled people. He says, he proposes a long list of categories. Exilés, immigrés, migrants, issus de l'immigration, expatriés, rapatriés, déplacés, déracinés, réfugiés, demandeurs d'asile, clandestins, sans-papiers, apatrides, bannis, I'm sure you understand more or less what I mean, proscrits, parias, errants, exclus, disparus, refoulés, déportés, internés, relégués, and many other. So, migrants, just one word, migrants, or all these categories. I think we have to take this seriously into account because words are important. Words mean something. They are positive or they are negative or they try not to be neither positive nor negative. And as I said, there are some relations with law and with judicial issues. let me add also now that this is my third important point, that if you consider just the last, excuse me to be so short, Göran, the last 30 years, not before. If you start with the 80s and you consider migrations from an European perspective, and we are a small part of the world, you have a lot of migration between Asian countries, between African countries. If you visit Hong Kong, for instance, I was so surprised, if you visit Hong Kong, every Sunday you will see thousands and thousands of women sitting in the streets in some places. These women are from Philippines, and they work as maids in families during the week, and on the Sunday they just meet in the street because they have no other place to. So you have lots of migrations like that. So I would like, from the European perspective, to insist now on three major points. 3 points. First of all, it is true that in some European countries, not all of them, but in some of them, we have been living a total transformation of who was a migrant. In my country, or in Germany, or in Belgium, to take these cases, England is a little bit different. In the United Kingdom is a little bit different because the Commonwealth made possible different processes. But if you take France, Germany, Belgium, these countries, what you see is that in the 50s, in the 60s, and in the early 70s, many people were what the French called travailleurs immigrés, migrant workers. In Germany, Gastarbeiter. And these people were more or less people that came male, I should say, male without woman, that were coming to these countries to work, to make some money, to send the money abroad, and one day to come back home. This was the model. So these people were included socially, they work, and excluded from anything else in the general life of the country. They did not vote, they did not speak French or German, or they didn't have to. They did not have children to send to the school. They didn't, you were quoting, I don't remember if it is this morning or this afternoon, Marshall's rights, and they were not so much concerned by the civic rights or the political rights and so on. So these people were socially included, and for all other aspects of their life, totally excluded. And then in my country in the mid-70s, maybe a little bit sooner or later in other countries, everything changed. Suddenly, on the one hand, family grouping was possible because of international treaties, and so you could have family, wife, children, and on the other hand, it was the beginning of unemployment, because big industries suddenly did not need so much these unskilled people. And I remember Italy at that time. It was a moment when all these people that have come, not from abroad, but from the south, were not so much useful in Fiat or northern industries. And the beginning of big problems. So what I want to say is that the definition of the people changed totally. They were not workers and migrants. They became citizens, and they did not have work. They were unemployed people. I exaggerate, but just to... So, it is important to understand that if today we have so awful movements against migrants in general, we have so much racism, and so it is also in a context when the situation of these people changed a lot. And if you read the very precise literature on racism, it is in the early 80s that social scientists understood that something was totally changing with racism. Racism was no longer mainly a classical colonialist physical racism, saying, the color of the skin or the hair and this kind of thing makes this person inferior. And if this person is inferior, I will be able to exploit or to dominate this person. The new racism, and this is for you, Donatella, is cultural and not physical, apparently. The new racist, what they say is, this person is culturally different from me. I don't want to see this person in my country. This person should go back in his or her country, or at least I should not see this person in my neighborhood. So the specialists call this sometimes differentialism, sometimes neo or new racism. But the racism apparently at that time became cultural. And of course, when those people that were migrants, now citizens, became more and more, in a more and more visible way, Muslim, which is a huge issue, then this new racism became cultural and religious. And this is why some people consider that we should use an expression such as Islamophobia in order to describe these new forms of hatred, which is connected with culture and which is connected with the idea that this other group is not so much inferior in the difference. It's not a question of inequalities, to say it a little bit different. It's a question of this person is threatening, is putting under pressure my own identity, my national identity, my values, this kind of oppression. So this was very important, and as you can understand, this leads to tensions, to problems, and also to new or renewed extreme right movements. If you want to understand the transformation of the extreme right or the rebirth of the extreme right in Europe, it has a lot to do with these new feelings, these new racist feelings connected with this new situation. I have no time to explain more precisely, but if you want, we can discuss that. That's the first main transformation during the 70s, 80s. The second main transformation, and in Italy it's very easy to say that, it's an inversion of flows of migration. When I was young, I'm rather old now, when I was young, at school, I had some friends of my age. The father and mother were Italian. I remember when I was 6 or 7 years old, my good friend was called Marmiroli, wonderful Italian name. So these people were sons of Italian migrants coming to France. Today, there is no Italian migrant coming to France. And what happened, and this began, is the very contrary. Italy is now a country of where people migrate to, not only, but so. And it is the same with Spain, it is the same with Portugal, it is the same with Greece, and it is certainly the same with other countries. So this is one case of inversion of the flows. But you have also many other new phenomena. For instance, in the 80s and 90s, and even in the beginning of this century, you had many people coming from Latin America to Spain and sometimes to Portugal, Brazilian. Today, most, not all, but many of these people come back to Latin America because of the crisis, and some of these people that go to Latin America are Spanish people, real Spanish people. I discussed with a friend who is a professor in a university in Santiago de Chile, in Santiago in Chile. He told me that there was recently a big competition in order to have suddenly, just his university, suddenly 100 new professors coming from Spain. This was the only condition. There were lots of candidates, too many candidates. So people want to migrate from Spain to Chile today. So this is absolutely new. And you have many other phenomena. You also have those people, if I take the French case, it's very interesting, that migrate from the north to the south. If you visit countries such as Morocco or Tunisia, you will meet these people, sometimes old people that say, I love sun, I am old, I have some money, life is not so expensive, less expensive than in... So I live in Morocco or in Tunisia, and sometimes when I have to visit the medical doctor, I spent 2 weeks in France, and so those people that I told you, rather young, the ones that go to England or to other parts of the world because they consider that it's not so interesting to live in France. So what I want to insist is on the fact that migration today are very different. The phenomenon is changing, is permanently changing. This, of course, opens the way to important debates among us, social scientists, For instance, is really the state so much weak today? Should we consider that the transnational logics, the word transnational, began to be used in the late 90s? It's a recent expression. So should we consider that the state is weak? And some people say no, and it is interesting to see also some people changing their mind. There is a very good American sociologist, Roger Waldinger, who started saying the state is strong, there are frontiers, and so on. And his last book is saying, well, I am changing my mind, more or less. So there are many ways to be migrant. And what people understand also, just to make the issue a little bit more complex also, that you have to deal with different ways to migrate. You don't have only those people that come, you don't have any interest in knowing where from, and you don't have any interest in knowing the way, the transit experience, that people that come from somewhere else and that arrive in a society and where the only problem will be integration. No, it's not like that. You have people that go through a country. They arrive in Lampedusa, and you find them a few weeks after in Ventimiglia trying to go to France. They don't want to stay in Italy. So those people say we must integrate these people who would not understand what is at stake. In France, we discover this with a very important phenomenon, Sangatte, which is a small city just at the entrance of the channel, of the tunnel under the channel. So migrants coming from Middle East mainly, arriving like in an entonnoir, I don't know the word, just you see this image, arriving and, well, being stopped there, but they want to go. So if you are a social scientist, you must work on these places where people live. You must study what happens in these camps. And you have many other camps in the Middle East and in many other places. So those people, of course, that die in the sea, that die in... So we must, now we know that trying to understand migration is also trying to understand all these steps, all these different moments, with some places sometimes that are very, very important. I have no time to develop, but we cannot think like we used to think. But this does not mean that the migrants are only poor people with terrible obstacles to meet and so on. And here also I go to your point, Donatella. Migrants have a very interesting experience if you want to know more about their culture. First of all, some very interesting sociological work demonstrate that they are connected. That is to say, they use internet, mobile phones, and so on, much more and much quicker than many other groups in our societies. They are very good in being connected. Then they produce forms of culture during their travel or when they arrive somewhere. I have a wonderful student from Japan. She came to Paris. She spoke perfectly French, which was very surprising. And she told me, I want to study the literature, the writings in the French suburbs, the migrants' literature. And I told her, well, all French sociology says that the main cultural expression in the French migrant suburbs, the only interesting form of culture is rap, the music. She said, no, I'm sure there should be some literature. And I don't know how she did, but she demonstrated that there is a wonderful literature expressing the life in the suburbs. So there are cultural expression. We should not take this out of our mind. And this expression of culture, I have another example. There was a great exposition in Mexico City, about the culture of migrants that go to the United States. It was fascinating. What I want to say is that this expression of culture have something today to do with international networks, international ways of life, and something to do with the experience of traveling like that, and something to do with the society where people live, and something to do with cultural import of cultural goods, to say it like that. I was quoting rap. Rap in France, I don't know in Italy. If I say music, rap, people understand immediately suburbs, migrants, and North American music. It's a mixture of these three very different elements. Now I would like to, I have some conclusions, so you tell me when I just have 5 minutes, Donatella, because I have still a little bit more? Yes. Okay, because I want to arrive to a point. But now I would like to add something. In the public debate, even the figures are usually very, could I say, unfair. For instance, I am not a demographer, but if you discuss with some demographers, they will tell you that all over the world, the demographic turn has been done. There are a very limited number of situations where, maybe in Africa, where the demographic turn does not exist. If you go in Tunisia, for instance, the rate of birth is more or less the same as the rate of birth in Italy or in France, 2 and something, I think so. So, when people say, with the huge demography of these countries, there will be millions and millions of migrants that will try, no, the problem is not demography. There will be maybe one day millions of migrants, but not for demographic reasons. And the figures we have are not so useful. For instance, in my country, we know how many people come in legally. We can have some idea of how many people come illegally. There are some ways to know that. But we don't make statistics on those people that go out of the country, of migrants going out. We know how many people go in. We don't know how many people go out. So what are the statistics? And so when we try to know something, we have very strange discovery. So this is also a very important point, social science. As social scientists, we should participate in the public debate with good data, with good statistics. So what I would like to do is that, and this is the third point, is that today in Europe, we are living in a time where more and more people are on the dark side of these transformations. There is more and more racism. And when we have these new migrants dramas, refugees and so on, then in most countries it is difficult to say that the public opinion is mainly in favor of supporting, helping, understanding, and so on. But emotion can transform the situation, at least partially, at least for a certain time. It is, I just have one very interesting example to propose to you. Just before this famous photo, I'm sure it was also very well known in Italy, of this very young baby dead on a beach, just before this photo was published in the media, there was a survey in France, and the result was 55% of the French don't want exile or refugees to be accepted in our country. Then the photo was circulated. And a few days after, a new survey. And the survey said, now 55% of the French are in favor of having refugees and so on. So emotion transformed the situation. Maybe just for a few days, I don't know. But you see, the importance of emotion is very interesting. But why is it so interesting? Is that suddenly what was at stake was not a Muslim. What was at stake was not a black person or an Arab person. What was at stake was not somebody who is maybe a terrorist. What was at stake was not somebody who is coming here to take the job of the French or the Italian citizen. No. Racism could not really be developed here because what was at stake was a baby, almost a baby. And so we understand better with this what are the fears that make possible so many hatred, so many negative feelings that make racism to be so strong. So now I would like to give my conclusion. My conclusion, I will give it like that. I will take the French case, but just as an example. If you follow what I was saying, if you accept the idea that we have a lot of diversity, that these problems are both domestic and global, intern and external. If you accept all this, then you will understand that you have in fact two main positions in the public debate. On the one hand, those who are in favor of a closed society and that would like their nation to be homogeneous and closed. And on the other hand, those who say we must have an open society and a nation if that should be open-minded and accept diversity and be tolerant. If you accept this idea of two different societies within the same society, then what you can see is that in the two blocks, of course it's more complex, in the two blocks you have some mobilization. On the negative block, the mobilization, you could call it anti-movement, anti-social movement, because these people are mobilized to exert a pressure, so they act collectively through, for instance, their votes. In France, towards the National Front, there is a pressure towards no opening, no frontier being stronger, and maybe more finishing with Europe, finishing with Euro, and all these ideas. So the state of the opinion can be transformed into some action, some collective action on the dark side. There are other forms of collective action. You can have violence, people that attack. Maybe you remember this terrible photography of an Hungarian journalist in front of migrants, I don't remember where it was, they go home and being supported by other people. So this is the dark side. And the question for me is, can we imagine a collective action that maybe we could call a movement on the other side? So before saying a few words on this, I must just insist on one point. I think that today the social science should take seriously into account in the same analysis the two dimensions. Usually you have specialists, good specialists of positive social movements and very good specialists of National Front, extreme right, and so on. I think it would be very interesting to try to organize intellectually the meeting of the two dimensions. Now, if I go on what I could call, it's a little bit normative, but the positive dimension, here, what I see is that you have many people with some forms of collective organizations that are willing to do something. You have NGOs, you have churches, different kind of churches. You also have intellectuals. It's very important, and I will give an example very soon. You have intellectuals, you have political actors. All this has something to do with a political pressure in order to be open-minded and so on, and in order, I fully agree with what you said in this morning, I think, but rights. Today, what is important are rights, how to be sure that people have the right to have rights and can exert more and more rights. So you have this, but the problem is that the migrants themselves are not so much able to become collective actors. A little bit, but they are heteronomous, if I can say it like that. They cannot, it's very difficult for these people to act by themselves because they are in a very weak situation. These people are sometimes very educated. It is the best people in a country that try to escape. It is the people, the more dynamic, the more educated people. It's not the non-educated and not dynamic people that might migrate. But these people, it's very difficult for them to be organized. They can be organized, as I was saying, through internet, the mobile phone, because they belong to some diaspora, for example. But the problem is, how is it possible to articulate the two dimensions, the action of collective actors, such as NGO and so on, intellectual, and the action of migrants that theoretically cannot be organized. It's very difficult. And here the problem is that the arena for collective action in our experience is usually our nation state. We are in Italy and we do something in Italy. But the problems, as I tried to say, are global, at another level. So this makes these issues very, very difficult, but very interesting for the sociologists. Well, I could add many other things, but I wanted to insist on this, and I will finish just with to remember you something. In the late 70s, and I was part of the committee that did that, there was in France a big movement, to say it like that, or action, let us say, in order to go in the China Sea so that we could help boat people not to be killed but or not to die in the sea. And so, and the key person in this organization, in this movement, was somebody, maybe you know his name, Bernard Kouchner. He's a very important guy because this guy was known as a French doctor, one of those people that have been acting in the late 60s as a medical doctor in Biafra and these kind of things, on the one hand. But he was also a 68 child, to say it like a political guy. And at that time, most of these people that were in politics were previously communist or leftist, to be very short. So why did the movement, why did this campaign was so successful? With, at the end, a meeting in a big hotel in Paris, Donatella knows, l'Hôtel Lutetia, just in front, and you know, just in front of the place where I work, and I was there, where Jean-Paul Sartre shook the hand with Raymond Aron, which was a very interesting moment in the French intellectual life because it was the total failure of Jean-Paul Sartre. He was obliged to shake the hand of Raymond Aron and they were going together to save people trying to escape communist Vietnam. So why was it so successful? And this is my last point. It was very successful because we had an articulation of two different logics. On the one hand, a humanitarian logic, NGO, etc. And on the other hand, a political logic, because all these people that were part of this committee were people that were previously Marxist, leftist, communist, and everything that you can imagine, but at that moment that were saying goodbye to Marxism, communism, and so on. It was the moment when the so-called new philosophers were appearing in the French debate. So they had a good political reason to act. We want to demonstrate that we are finishing with Marxism. So we are going to save people that escape communist regime in Vietnam. And on the other hand, they were acting as humanitarian. And so what I wanted to say is that there will be, maybe in the future, more stronger movements on this basis if we are able to articulate the political, the humanitarian, that is, the rights, and, I said it too briefly, some cultural aspects, taking seriously into account the fact that these people that we want to save are not only pure, poor economic beings, that they have also some cultural background. Thank you, Donatella.
Thank you, Michel, very much. I will, I was happy to see that our books are useful to keep. And I have a PowerPoint, but I don't want to give yet another presentation. I want to be short and leave some space for the discussion if some of you have questions. I just wanted to, no, the other one. Just wanted to reflect on some also general lessons which comes from this presentation and from the debate today. One issues which is relevant, I think, in thinking in sociological and political terms about the crisis is the need to change our paradigms. Both Göran and Michel said it was in this way until the 90s. The 90s changed things as a critical junctures, as neo-institutional type of approach said, but they also challenged some expectations that we have in the social sciences, which were oriented mainly to think about phenomenon as trends. So we had all the Aoization type of terms, modernizations, urbanizations, the expectations that the world was going to be better. So until the 90s, in this period, what economic sociologists have called les 30 glorieuses, the 30 years in which inequalities was reduced both in the south and in the north of the globe, because there were three different types of models, the so-called first world, second world, and third world, that all were forced to be concerned about inequalities, also the developmental state in the south. But then what happened in the 90s with this change, sudden challenge to the expectations that everything was going to be better, represented also, I think, a challenge for our way of looking at social processes. It meant we cannot think in terms of trends. We have also to introduce cycles, but we have also to introduce the possibilities of thinking in terms of critical junctures, so of moment in which, rather than having stable path, or what new institutionalists called incremental type of changes that are slowly moving in some directions, instead we have sudden transformations, not all for the better, and we have these changes in the 90s, but I think also today's, because today the type of development that both Göran and Michel have addressed from different perspectives are develops which starts from, I think, a new critical junctures, a moment in which what seemed to be a transformations towards back again the dominance of the free market over the social protections was challenged again. And the discourse of rights, which entered also the xenophobic type of scenes, because they're also talking of rights, is, I think, a sign of these contestations, which is typical of moment of changes. And the critical junctures have some characteristics. They tend to be open-ended. So it's a change which is not structured by the context. And this is something that I think both Göran and Michel have addressed when they said there is a potential for a positive change, but we have to look at the details of these transformations and allow for the power of agency, for the capacity of intellectual humanitarians and so on to intervene in the process. So processes are open-ended, conjunctural, while in the social sciences we are accustomed to think in terms of determinants, causal explanations. We have also to allow for this type instead of transformations which we cannot predict, which we have to expect different potential ways. But then critical junctures are also path dependent in the sense that some transformations tend then to become stable. There are moments of choices that then determines what the future is. And this is, I think, why it is so relevant to think about inequalities and the potential to overcome them, effects of migrations, and the potential to direct them in a positive directions. And also, Michel was quoting Ulrich Beck and his call for going beyond nationalist type of methodologies to go towards a cosmopolitan methodologies, but to realize that this doesn't mean to expect that everything is moving in the same directions. So that also globalizations, as we thought it in the past, as a sort of path towards always more integrations, towards the fact that what happens here as an effect also very far away is part of the story, but that part of the story is also that the same effects, the same causes have very different effects in the transformations. And in terms of the potentials to mobilize, we were also accustomed. Michel wrote also about globalization trends in social movements, the cosmopolitan dimensions and the identities of social movements. But what we saw later on was that also globalization was not a trend, but that it took instead different type of characteristics in different moments, and in some occasions could also mean going back to a very domestic type of determinants, to characteristics which assume very different character in different countries. So with this evolution in recent times, what we see at the same time is element of solidarities, of interest, especially within Europe, for what happens in other countries. Oxy, only Greek people knew what it meant until a few months ago. Then it became a term on which many people mobilized and started to have an idea with the Greek referendum. And this is, for instance, an activist from Portugal using the terms. So there is a sort of integration in the sense of looking at each other, but there is also a sense that our destiny is different in different areas, not only of the world, but also of Italy. This is of Europe. This is another picture of demonstrations by German activists who started to be a bit ashamed of the role that Germany was taking in the conflict with Greece, and Deutschland, du mieses Stück Scheiße, is Deutschland, you small piece of shit, which testifies of very strong internal contestations, also of what the positions of the different countries should be about issues of globalizations or even of Europeanization. What does it mean this for social movements? We were accustomed to see cosmopolitanism as something which favored the acquisitions of conceptions of rights. Human rights were thought to be as a sort of improvement over citizenship rights, because it was something which was not granted only on the basis of nationality, but that was granted to all human beings. But when sociologists, political scientists started to think about the effect of the transformations, also the effect of leaving aside citizenship rights for human rights, they also saw that there was a weakening of the type of rights which were defended under the label of human rights and of those who were defended under the label of citizenship rights. So what I mean is that conceptions of citizenship as conceptions of rights tend to be also very contested, and that this happens also on the basis of an extension of the claims by normal citizens to intervene in general transformations. The pictures I showed about the recent wave of refugees moving from one country to the others, I think we're telling also because in the pictures of the protest by the refugees, what I think was evident was that also for those who have yet to claim the right to have right, this is perceived as a moment in which they can put forward their own claims. So the migrants who came walk barefoot from North Africa up to Sweden were not people who were just pleading for charity. But you could see, probably also influenced by the fact that they came from countries in which there had been wave of movements, they were claiming for their rights. They were using forms of protest. They were using common languages in order to say, we are here and we have the right to be here, which is different from previous wave of migration also, where migrants protested, but for instance as workers, as Gastarbeiter in Germany and so on. So we see that there are protests. As Michel already said, it is also true that it is not easy for groups that are denied the right to have rights to organize and protest. And this is a general issue that in social movement studies we address. We grew as a discipline in the 70s, in the Trente Glorieuses. So we grew thinking that social movements were a constant type of agent for modernizations, for extension of rights. They played a role with the labor movement, they played a role with the new social movements, and we expected that a series of transformations were positive for the capacity of the citizens to intervene in politics and in the society. Education, for instance, was more and more a right. Urbanizations was an element which tended to facilitate the mobilizations of the people. Which are the expectations now for people interested in citizens' participations? As Michel said, there is a contestations. There are good movements and there are bad movements. Citizens of different belief and conceptions exploit the crisis of institutional politics in order to put pressures. And we saw at the same time the positive examples of solidarity movement with migrants that contributed to that turning point of the picture of the dead body of the child on the beach of Greece, which contributed also in Italy. There was a nice indicator of this change. The leaders of the radical rights that had tried to take advantage of the xenophobic trend suddenly realized that they were losing votes, and they offered to give their house for refugees. It was a similar trend change to the one that you mentioned about France with the opinion polls. So it's a moment in which there is a lot of mobilization, but there is a lot of mobilizations which is unexpected and unaccounted for in social movement theories. Like I think other fields of knowledge was more accustomed to think in terms of general trends towards improvement of life. So how can we explain and what can we expect if we want to find the solutions to answer Göran's last questions about when will this change happen? If inequality is not our destiny, what can we do and how in order to change choices which have been made? And I think in social movement studies there is some hint, some suggestions about characteristics of the movements we see moving around. Even today in Pisa there was movements related with our initiatives. But I think we have also to innovate on this in order to try to understand the positive aspects of what is happening. Social movement studies says social movements, since the labor movement, are favored in moments of abundance, in moments of well-being. The labor movement, typically, the wave of strikes happen in period of full employment. unemployment is not favorable for claims of working class rights. But there are movements also in times of crisis. Often unexpectedly, some wave of protest happened, for instance, in the New Deal, before the New Deal, during the first Great Recession, and they had some characteristics different from the movements of today's. They were weak to a certain extent, weak in the capacity of finding institutional channels of access to policymakers. They were sometimes using more radical forms of actions, and they were more ideological than pragmatic. But still, there were movements that sometimes started very important process of mobilization. So the first lessons for social movement scholars from today's development is that sometimes citizens mobilize not because they perceive that the situation is improving, but rather mobilize because they perceive that if they do not do something, the situation is going to grow worse and worse. And this is the story of the mobilization since 2011. Egyptians didn't mobilize in Tahrir Square in the moment of liberalizations of the regimes. It was a moment instead of growing illiberalism. The same was in Tunisia. In Greece or in Spain, the protest happened when activists thought that right-wing or left-wing parties were all pursuing a politics of austerities that they didn't think was positive for their own countries. So there are moments in which even weak movements then suddenly expanded. And this, I think, is something that for social movement scholars, it's a type of process that we need to try to understand, thinking at movements not as dependent variables to be explained, but also agent capable of changing opportunities. There is another concept in the literature which I think is useful also for our discussion. Karl Polanyi, who is an important, today we would say political economist, at the time was a political scientist and sociologist, he studied the what he called first great transformations in what was seen as the first wave of liberalism. And he said capitalism is always there, but it is made of waves between the privilege given to free market and privilege given instead to social protections. And social movements, what he called counter movements, were often reacting to the waves of free market in the name of a moral economy, which they saw as important in the past. So even in the first great transformations Polanyi was talking about, so the development of free capitalism, some of the movements, the food riots and so on, were moved, he said, and other also historians said, were moved not only by economic deprivation, and which had social consequences, as Göran said, but they were also moved by unethical conceptions of what they considered to be their rights. And I think that this is very important also to understand the movements now. Neoliberalism in its development, so the second great transformation using Polanyi language, was oriented towards thinking that citizens were going to accept the argument that free market would bring about economic growth, were ready to wait for these transformations to happen, and that it was easy to spread what Colin Crouch called an immoral type, cynical type of discourse. It was the discourse that in the name of economic growth, you could accept some victims. You could accept that the unemployed remained unemployed and not very protected because this improved the economic conditions by reducing salaries. Counter-movements tended to react to this type of discourses also with an ethical type of counter-arguments, which is quite widespread nowadays. In social movement studies, there is also another argument, which has not been taken very seriously by social movement scholars of my generations. We were the generations of the Trente Glorieuses, of the improving type of society, in which we thought that social movements were no longer interested in socioeconomic equalities, that the class conflicts was pacified, and that we could move towards new type of issues. But at the same time, there was reflections, especially by historical sociologists, economic sociologists like Wallerstein and its school, Giovanni Arrighi and others, who noticed that capitalism is a world type of phenomenon and that it produces different types of movements in different types of societies. And I think what is the message of the word system type of approach is that in fact you find different types of anti-systemic movements and that you can see them mobilized in different forms under different circumstances. Last, there was recently also a reflection on is there time for a new class to develop? We have invited at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence Guy Standing, who is a sociologist who is reflecting on precarious people as a new class, or at least about the potential for new collective identities to develop. The multitudes, the precarious people are terms which have been used in order to try to single out potential new forms and new identities for mobilization. I promised that I would not speak too much, so what I want to do is just to show, no? Yes. What I think is a bit a map or an agenda of some of our research at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, which we hope to develop also in the future, trying to connect even more the social movement agenda with the discourse on equalities that Göran presented and discussed today, and with the discourses of socio-cultural effects of transformations that Michel has addressed, talking about the migration issues. So the point that we want to develop, which I think we need to think about, is we have some common type of legalizing crisis global, but they affect different ways in different areas. They are connected, but this does not necessarily are the same. We have similarities, but we have different positions, different areas, different countries. What we experienced last crisis is that there is no Europe that is developing common connections. That the crisis has singled out differences which were there and which are now even stronger and more visible. But these reflections on, at the same time, common basis and different type of implementation of these conditions in different countries, I think is to push us at the same time to single out in the different spheres of social life the conditions for the development of social movements, and then singling out the cross-national difference in this. And one of the reasons why I was reading The Killing Fields of Inequalities when I started to think about this conference was that I think we need to reflect a lot about the socio-economic conditions. That it seemed not so relevant a few decades ago when we thought about the pacifications of the social cleavages, about no-class societies, about a situation in which socio-economic conflicts were not central. And I think that thinking about the issues of which are the socio-economic conditions that we are facing, either if we look at social movements or if we look also at other types of phenomenon. We have to think about three different capitalist temporalities. We have to think in terms of big capitalist formations, which is something that Turenne did in the past, but then was marginalized in some social movement studies. So we have to think about the development of socioeconomic systems which seem to be victorious, to be on the winning side a few years ago, but that is developing with different characteristics than the capitalism of the past. In the social sciences, there is a difference between Fordism and post-Fordism, singling out the very different characteristics that capitalism can take. There is also, and we have to think about that, alternance in the socio-economic characteristics between growth and crisis. The late neoliberalism that we face nowadays and the strange non-disappearance of a system which is clearly in crisis is a moment in which transformations are needed, but also at the same time is a moment in which transformations are difficult because the resources are declining. So what I call late neoliberalism, I think, is a general conditions that can, on the one hand, on the supply side, push for social movements, but also on the other hand, to make claims on against social inequalities, at the same time more stringent, more needed, and more difficult. And also we have to consider that the crisis meant very different type of conditions in different countries. So in the European peripheries, in the plural, from the so-called pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Spain, and Greece, to the core of the European Union, with Germany at the center and France near to it, what we saw is a constant transformations of the crisis, which started as a bank crisis, which developed in Greece, but not in other countries, as a debt crisis, which was deeply rooted in diversity in competitiveness of the different countries, with the peripheries going back to their role and difficulties. It was a crisis of trade imbalances, and this is a crisis of social effects of social inequalities, which has divided Europe very, very clearly. If you look at all statistics, even Eurostat, which are not often so reliable, but yet give a general image, we see that the crisis, first of all, is not declined, and second, that it created enormous differences within Europe itself. The crisis of the late neoliberalism is also a crisis of responsibility in political terms. So once again, going back to what Göran was saying, inequality is not a faith, and inequality is not something that the citizens consider as part of their destiny. They've been accustomed in the Trente Glorieuses to think that the state, that politics, has to intervene in order to reduce inequalities. Rights like rights to a labor, rights to education, rights to public health. Wherever we go, with a past experiences as core capitalist societies and democratic societies. In the Second World, under the real socialism, or in the developed countries with developmental type of regimes, what made for the legitimacy of these regimes was the fact that they were competing on granting to their citizens what they call a modicum. At least the conceptions that these were rights you had to approximate to. I think the crisis of institutions nowadays, and is sufficient to look at Eurobarometer data about trust in institutions to see the effects of this crisis, is that politics suddenly, in these critical junctures of the 90s, Göran and Michel mentioned both talking about different things, renounced to instruments to address inequalities. Liberalization, privatizations, deregulations, all are terms which means the state has less capacity to intervene towards what also towards right. And this is also an aspect which I think we have to consider, the political dimensions, which was not addressed until now, which is a fundamental point in order to see to which extent we have the capacity to change inequalities, to address crises like the refugees one. And also here, I think what we see is that there are increasing differences in Europe. We had the impressions that social movements of the years 2010s were tendentially not interested in politics and not relevant for politics, thinking in terms of institutional politics, that they developed in the squares autonomous or separated from the palaces of politics. But what we are seeing is the unexpected effects of these movements on institutional politics in different forms in different countries. In Greece, it was suddenly the victory of a party which had been there for a few years, but a minoritarian party of the so-called radical left. In Spain, it was the increase in the strength of Podemos, but also in the UK. You cannot explain Corbyn's victory in the internal struggle in the Labour parties without thinking that also there the movements had some effects on politics, and a differentiated one. So we don't know yet how, but it seems that once again we as sociologists were surprised by the fact that what we could have predicted, a tendency towards less and less relations between official politics, institutional politics, and social movement, was suddenly challenged, maybe even in our countries. So effects, I think, are developing from these big general transformations in terms of the characteristic of the society, politics, and cultural systems, which directly have an effect on the capacity of the citizens to influence their destiny. And maybe to address Göran's questions about how can we change the trend towards growing inequalities. So increasing inequalities and precarity has produced also at the cultural level a tendency I was talking about this morning towards less and less capacity of constructing universal values, of constructing subjectivities, of constructing collective identities. In general, it is difficult for those who don't have the right to have rights to build an identity for themselves. But at the same time, and in Michel's book there is a lot about this, there has been also a tendency towards rethinking categories of universalism which went beyond the critical moments that universalistic concepts coming from the French revolutions underwent, and that have the potential of constructing new collective identities. So increasing inequalities, weakening of sense of identities, fluid societies, lack of communities that can construct strong identities is there. But at the same time is there also some work by citizens around this type of issues. And these are the last boxes. The technicians are working on this. The last boxes of my graph and the final words. What's happening in terms of social movements? It happens that strangely, unexpectedly, surprising for us, there have been strong movements. So movements that we thought should not have arisen because they were not the conditions that we imagined, but that to a certain extent created their own conditions. And what we saw interviewing people in the streets, activists, today we were too late for the interviewing the activists at the protest, but this is what we have been doing at several demonstrations, where we have seen that the people who are mobilized comes from many different social groups, come from different cultural backgrounds, from different religions and generations especially, but all share the impressions that they belong to the losing side of the development since 1990s, so on the losing side of the critical junctures. At the same time, I think what it is important is that they not only feel losers, but that they were slowly empowered by these forms of mobilization. So to take an example which puzzled me, how did it happen that suddenly in a party which became more and more detached from civil society, like the Labour Party in the UK, activists of the students' movement and then of the precarious movement thought that there was a chance to occupy to a certain extent the party. How did it happen that activists in Greece thought that there was the possibility to challenge the bipartisan system of the conservative and center-right and center-left and build an alternative? I think that this is something which is happening slowly, and that we can understand it if we look not only at preconditions, but also at the capacity of groups, activists, intellectuals, and so on, to change their own conditions. A Latin American political theorist, Laclau, has talked of populist reasoning and reasons in the sense of the need to recreate a conception of the people. What is the people is, he says, an empty signifiers. But in moment of crisis, what we perceive as happening at the level of the civil societies is that there is a rethinking and an attempt to develop new categories. And finally, this is happened also inventing new ways, a way of doing politics. movements are usually considered as movements of the street. In fact, there was the term street politics. But these movements nowadays are more movements of the squares, and they have been called so, to stress the fact that what characterized this movement as an innovation from Tahrir Square, Casbah in Tunis, Syntagma Squares, Puerta del Sol, and so on, to Koty Park, Gezi Park, Maidan in Ukraine, was the fact that civil society organizations, citizens, decided to create their own spaces to debate, and they occupied in the long-term perspective squares. And what did they do was not only protesting but talking a lot. And this was relevant for the constructions of these identities. So I don't want to take more time. Maybe there is some questions to Göran and Michel in the audience. But what I wanted to stress is that we should change, as sociologists and political scientists, a lot of our expectations, a lot in our perspective, in order to be able to single out challenges but also opportunities in this type of situations. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the fact that critical junctures are open-ended and conjunctural in their development also means that we have space for having a positive influence on the societies. Thank you. So I take back my role as chairwoman. Any question in the audience from the floor? Yes, Alexandra.
I have a question for Professor Göran regarding his proposals to deal with inequality. And one of them, if I remember well, it was hierarchization, empowerment of bargaining and representation. And I was thinking that there was this dilemma, kind of persistence between reaching the same position that elites are having exactly through this process of hierarchization, or eliminating the actual boundaries and the actual hierarchies. And how would you explain hierarchization as being like a solution to inequality? Because actually, if we apply this kind of solution, what we are doing is to want to reach the position that elites are having and those that are in powerful position, and not to really eliminate the actual hierarchies that are persisting and that are the basis of systems of oppression.
Myself badly, because I mean the whole idea of the hierarchization is, or the concept is the dismantling totally or partly of hierarchies. And this is a process which, to some extent, I mean, has even become part of post-1968 capitalist culture. So, I mean, in many large corporations, the idea has been to compress the hierarchy between, I mean, the executives and the employees, and this is very much, I mean, a phenomenon which you find in the IT, in the information technology industry, in the operation in many corporations in California, for instance. And another aspect of the hierarchization, which I also explicitly take up in the book and when I theorize about this, is the establishment of representation rights of the subalterns, including, I mean, we have seen that in academia in the last 50 years. I mean, that students get representation on university boards and so on. I mean, that's also a kind of a process of hierarchization. And thirdly, of course, I mean, the most powerful example of the hierarchization is is collective bargaining. When okay, you do have a kind of a hierarchy in the firm, but on the other hand, the subalterns, I mean, have the right to fight for certain rights, and have already, I mean, some rights of collective bargaining. So, I mean, de-hierarchization does not at all mean, I mean, that we, the subalterns, I mean, should become, I mean, like the bosses of Lehman Brothers, for instance. I mean, among the worst and most arrogant hierarchs, I mean, you could ever find. On the contrary, I mean, it means the compression of the organizational hierarchy and the promotion of counter powers to the subaltern. I mean, they are students in relation to universities, or workers and employees in relation to employers. Therefore, I mean, I do think, I mean, that after all we agree on this, perhaps.
Thank you.
I would like to address a question to the professor from École Normale Superiore. You mentioned in your presentation the relation of globalization and migration flows. Do you see the relation of globalization and localization due to the development of post-Fordism and local labor systems within countries? How do you, would you interpret this, considering also the overpassing of the methodological nationalism that was mentioned in your presentation? Thank you.
Well, we are discussing different phenomena that have some relations, but there is no too easy determination or too easy determinism to have in mind. If you want to discuss post-Fordism, historically, what I know, I'm not an expert, but what I know is that it started in the mid-70s. And it started in some factories, including in Italy with Olivetti, but with Volvo and so on. And the idea was that we could organize work at the workplace without terrorism, and for this is connected with terrorism and the possibility to transform workers into consumers. Fordism was both having unskilled workers, like Charlie Chaplin in the modern Les Temps Modernes, in Timelight, I would say, and so on the one hand, and having the workers making money enough to buy cars, to say it just like that. So this is the idea that was declining concretely in the mid-70s, that began to decline at that moment. Globalization, usually people say, the recent wave of globalization, because some economists will tell you that the highest moment of globalization was before First World War. So, but if you take the Trente Glorieuses and so on, globalization really began with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the late 80s. So the two phenomena are distinct. But it is true that they follow the same, they are convergent, or they follow the same way. That is to say, if you are in a post-Fordist world, then You can imagine more individualism. You can imagine the end of social conflicts within the factories, because Fordism was very important for the working class movement. You don't understand the working class movement if you don't know how the big factories were organized. And so the two phenomena are distinct and are connected, but they don't appear at the same moment, and they don't follow the same determinations. To say very, very shortly, you don't understand globalization without the idea of the end of the Soviet Empire. Remember Fukuyama? Comment il s'appelle le politologue? Fukuyama, who just declared at the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall, he said, it's the end of history, now we shall have democracy, liberal democracy, and the market. Democracy, I'm not sure, the market is globalization. I mean, so this is what I want to tell you. It's two different phenomena with, of course, some connection, but they don't appear at the same moment.
Uda, yes. Uda and then Ivan.
Hello, I have a question for Professor Michel. My question is how to move beyond putting categories, labeling, classifying this person as a refugee, this person as like immigrant, this person as like an expat. Because, for example, recently I read an article and in The Guardian, it was about why do we call like Western people from certain background as expat, why we classify others as immigrant. And like my main question is about how to move beyond the discriminatory characteristics which revolve around the discourse about migration in general. Thank you.
Well, I would like to give a very general answer to your precise point, but because it's a huge issue. There are some moments when we find the right words and everybody knows that these are the right words. I can give the French case. I'm sorry to take this, but just take it as an example. At the end of the 19th century in France, in the year 1880, 1890, a certain number of words who almost did not exist became suddenly central in the public debate. And you can find it very easily when you look at a dictionary, because in some dictionaries they tell you when a word appears. It's very interesting. In the French case, régionalism appeared at that moment. Laïcité appeared at that moment. Intellectual appeared at that moment. Antisemitism, which was imported from Germany, but appeared at that moment, and many other words. Which means that at that moment people were able to find words that were adapted to the situation and that were accepted by everybody. At the beginning, before Second World War, anti-Semitism was an opinion, for instance. It was not a crime. So many people used to say, I am anti-Semitic. Just like that. Just like you say, I don't like coffee, or I don't like this movie. No, well, I don't like Jews. I am anti-Semitic. It was an opinion. And of course, this appears everywhere as a word that people should use. Now, I think that we are in a moment when we don't have the good word for many things. We don't have. This is why you have so many, in the social science, so many categories that begin with post. Post-national society, post-industrial, post-democratic, post-this, or neo-this, and neo-that. And so, which means we don't have the good vocabulary. We can say just something is coming after something else. Now, I come to your point. I will never accept vocabulary which would not be accepted by the people that are at stake. If I say to somebody, refugee, if this person say, okay, you can call me a refugee, I am not sure it will be the right word, but what is sure is that those people that are the first ones that are concerned by this, will agree, which is a very important beginning. I remember a debate, it's also a French case, excuse me, but I had a debate with a good friend of mine who was the main organizer and the president. He became the president of the first black movement in France, which was called CRAN, Conseil représentatif des associations noires de France. So these people decided to create a movement, a black movement. And I discussed with him one day, and he told me, I hate when people call me in French black. Because he said, I want them to call me noir. And I say, why do you say that? He said, when people say black, it means that they don't want to say that I am black, that I am noir, because they have the feeling that it is a racist categorization. And so they feel guilty to look at my color, so they use a kind of euphemisation, and so I don't like this. So okay, I will tell you black. In French, noir. I will not say black with the English word. And so for me, il est noir. He's noir because he wants to be noir, and I consider. And then after that, we can discuss other matters. So my answer to what you say is, first of all, be sure that the people you are speaking about can agree with the categorization that you use. For me, it's very important. It is not enough, but it would be the very beginning. And also, there is another point in what you ask. We are discussing issues that are part of the public debate. We are not comparing Max Weber and Émile Durkheim on this or on that in a very abstract and theoretical discussion. No, we are discussing migration, inequality, any real concrete issues. And the problem is that our vocabulary is the same than the vocabulary of ordinary people. We use, as social scientists, the same words as are used in the media, in the street, and so. So another problem is, how can we pass from ordinary notions to, let us say, to be a little bit elegant, sociological concepts. I've been working myself during years and years, and I'm not the only one in this room, on terrorism. Terrorism is really a word that everybody uses. Can we propose a concept, a sociology? Here things are different. So your question could be also, okay, in the daily life you have many words. Some are dirty, some are very positive, and so on and so on. Some are accepted by the actors, others are not, okay. But can we, as social scientists, know exactly the concept that we put under such or such words? This would be also an element of answer.
There was also a question from Ivan. Yeah.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the three of you for the very inspiring speeches you gave today. I would like to make a short comment, and then it's like a general question, so whoever feels comfortable can answer. So Professor Therborn mentioned that inequality is not self-existent, so it's created. It's there because of political elites, because of maldistribution, so we can influence that. Professoressa Della Porta was speaking during the inaugurational speech. It was in Italian, but I think I managed to grab the key points about the banks and other financial institutions who are simply too big to fail, and we're obliged to save them, at least. That's how we think. So I will slightly move also to the example we had today when the group of students were asking for the Italian president to pay their taxes, as I understood, because of a recent reform in the educational system. So we have detected the main reasons of inequality, of expanding neoliberalism, etc. But then still we're so inert, we're so passive, we're so uninterested. So, are we masochist? I mean, as people, as a humankind, or we simply are ignorant and we simply do not like to understand, to face reality? I mean, I know it's a very general, a very vague question, but yeah, thank you.
So, exactly what was the question?
Why people perceive inequalities as being there? They suffer from inequalities, but they do not mobilize.
Well, people differ, and therefore, I mean, there are different answers to this. And I'll put together a few sort of as they come up to my mind. One of them, which we know, I mean, this is based on hard evidence of survey data. Most people in most countries have a strong underestimation of the amount of inequality in their own country. So I mean, so that's one very major reason. And another reason is that vital inequality is very little known outside small groups of specialists, and even among social scientists. So I mean, many people, I mean, who don't know, I mean, the enormous differences of life expectancy or health expectancy among people in rich countries, for instance. And here, a major reason for that is that it's not that easy. So, I mean, we have a major difference between vital inequality and other kinds of inequality, in the sense that for all others, inequality is something which the victim notices first and sort of reacts to. For instance, I mean, women are the experts on patriarchy because they were the victims or targets of it, and black people are the experts on racism and so on, because I mean they or other groups in other countries, because I mean they are the ones who first notice it. But the poor people who have a good chance, I mean, to live a very short life, they normally don't know that, and don't until it's too late, so to speak, and they are sort of dying. And that means, I mean, that it has been so far very difficult, I mean, to create a social movement, a social awareness of vital inequality. But this is to some extent changing now, because, well, in contrast to French people, I'm not very keen on using my own country as an example to the world, or sort of. But there's one particular case I think, I mean, is worth mentioning, because Sweden is one of the few countries in which there has been a political response to the inequality of life expectancy and health expectancy. It started, ironically, the WHO team, which made the study of the social determinants of health, petitioned the then Swedish Minister of Health, a conservative Christian Democrat, asking her to take some initiative to bring up this issue in Sweden. And she said, no, I mean, we can't, meaning the bourgeois government, I mean, we can't do any politics of this. So no. We'll support your report in the Assembly of the WHO, that it should be approved by the Assembly of the WHO, but we can't do anything. Can't do anything political about that in Sweden. The immediate result of that was that two social democratically governed cities in Sweden, the second and the third largest cities, set up their own commissions about health and inequality, and brought in, I mean, a number of both people from the social services and from, but also from the trade unions and the immigrant associations and well, civil society generally. And that has now resulted in the current social democratic government to set up a national commission on health and inequality in Sweden. So that it is possible, I mean, to do some progressive politics about health and inequality, but it's much tougher for those reasons. Then there are some other answers to your question. I had a couple of weeks ago, I was at a similar event to this, although with less protocol and so on, but nevertheless, similar event at a Łódź University in Poland. And at the same time, I also had some meetings with people from the media in connection with the launch of the Polish translation of this, The Killing Fields of Inequality. So I met, I mean, a broad spectrum of the ruling stratum of today's Poland, the media people and the academic intelligentsia. And one of the things they told me, well, I mean, okay, I mean, there are rich and poor people, but we think, I mean, we have worked very hard and to get what we have got. And we think we have a right to keep that and to give that to our children and so on. And we don't really care about the rest and so on. I mean, I think that's another reason. So I mean, many people in Western Europe, I mean, would be cautious to say that in public or even in semi-public, I mean, to a foreign visitor. But I think that's a phenomenon in many countries. And finally, I mean, one other variant of cultural responses is what you have in the United States in comparison with Western Europe in particular. You have in the United States an extraordinary tolerance for economic inequality, which is largely based on an idea of an admiration of success. Wealth is largely a synonymous with success, and people admire the successful. That is interestingly coupled with another more egalitarian current, which is an immense resentment against what is called among these people the over-educated, arrogant elite, meaning basically liberal academics, who may tell them about, I mean, the dangers about having guns everywhere or what have you. It's a kind of appreciation of wealth and a contempt there is a great deal of, this is part of the answer why there is the responses to inequality are so different. There are a large number of people, I mean, who are full of contempt of the poor and so on. They are the losers. And this is, I mean, in some countries, I mean, this is, this contempt for the losers is a very important cultural trope. For instance, I mean, the big Tea Party movement, which was a major, or still is, I mean, a major social movement in the United States, was actually launched, I mean, by a television presenter exclaiming in television, I mean, why should we sort of help these losers, I mean, who can't pay their mortgages? We have to have a tea party, sort of, I mean, meaning a rebellion against this help to the losers. That's this kind of reaction, which is a very good manifestation of what I would think is another example of what Michel has written about evil. I mean, there is a great deal of evil in the world, and evil people, and the contempt of the poor, the contempt of the losers, I mean, is something we also have to fight, I'm afraid.
I will be very short in my answer. Your question is not for me. It's a good question, but it's not for me. I mean, it's not, I think, for social scientists. Social scientists, it's very difficult to explain or to analyze why men rebel, as there was a title of an important book 40 years ago by Ted Robert Gere, Why Men Rebel. It's difficult to understand why men rebel, but understanding why men don't rebel, it's too much. So there are so many fights, struggles, social movements, and let us understand what is at stake in these movements, fights, and so on. Maybe we can begin to think about your question, why some people don't rebel. But for me, as a social scientist, I will say it differently. As a professor, I would never let one of my students tell me, I want to make my PhD thesis on why men don't rebel. Never. I would tell him or tell her, go on the field, follow this, if you have an interest for rebellion, go where there is rebellion. This would be my answer. But maybe it could be interesting to make interview and to try to understand why in situations where you could imagine people would rebel, they don't. There is a book which was published, first of all in French, under the title Indignez-vous, which is something like rebel. And what is very interesting is that in France this book was bought by a huge amount of people, maybe 300,000 copies or something, I mean, huge, but nobody rebelled. And in Spain, the name of one of these movements that was quoted before by Donatella, the name of one is Indignados, which means we have read this book. So why French don't rebel, and why Catalan or in Catalogne or in Madrid people rebel? It's not so easy. Now I would like to try to bring you a beginning of an answer. There are situations where all the conditions for rebellion are not there. You could imagine that they are here, but that's not. So, and the French situation is very interesting. Donatella explained us, and I was very happy when she finished with politics. She explained us that the political situation is not the same in all the countries. Maybe in my country, I don't want to speak of France, but the conditions, the political conditions don't make possible to have rebellion, social movements, and so on. And this can change also. Suddenly, new events and so on. So the conditions that make actors act, the conditions, not the meaning of the action, but the condition, it is very important to understand if they are here or not. This would be a beginning of positive answer to your point.
And I think what one could add is that you can have different explanations for those who are affected by the inequalities. And there I think you have to consider that it is an issue of rights. So many of the people who are most affected by inequalities have very little civic and political rights. They are migrants, they are precarious people, not unionized, and so on. And then there is the big issues of symbolic. Pierre Bourdieu talked of having the droit de parole, the right to speak. And this shaming the victims has been a very widespread type of tendencies. Unemployment is considered to be a shame for the people who are unemployed. Debt, because this has been also a crisis of debt for individuals. Not only the countries were indebted, but also the people. In Germany, significantly, you have the same word to say it is your fault, and to say debt in terms of economic debt is Schulden. And I think this is part of the story. It is considering the losers not as victim of a system, but considering the losers as responsible themselves for their destiny. For the non-affected, I think that there has been very strongly hegemonic for a certain moment the ideas that inequalities were good for the societies because it pushes for competition and so on. Because on the economic market, if there are many unemployment, it means the prices of salaries go down and the countries becomes more competitive. But I also think now things are changing, and you cannot really predict exactly when. Maybe in France we will have a big strike, Air France will start, and this topic will be thematized.
I can add just one point. There is a book by a colleague, a French sociologist, François Dubay. The title is something like Les inégalités injustes. Because from an objective perspective, you can consider that these inequalities are high or are not so high. But from a subjective perspective, the situation will be totally different. People will consider that some inequalities, even very important, are normal or are fair. And that a very small inequalities is absolutely not fair. And so maybe people will rebel or fight or have a struggle for something which, from an objective perspective, is almost nothing, but people will consider that it is impossible to accept this small difference, for instance, in my salary, and then consider that a huge difference between my salary and the boss salary is okay. So it's also, there is also a dimension of things are not only objective, they are also subjective. And it's part of your question.
Thank you very much to Göran, Michel, to the public, and now there will be a drink served in Sala Gran Priore and something to eat as well, if I understood well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alors ça y est, ton année, ta nouvelle position et ton année est lancée. Ça y est, oui. C'est très bien. Ben, je suis très content d'avoir été avec toi aujourd'hui.
Moi aussi.
C'était vraiment sympa.
Unfortunately, Saturday afternoon was more difficult. And,
yes, it is. But it's okay.
But
This was made.
And this is something which will.
I was remembering you invited me to listen to Therborn and Charles Tilly 40 years ago in Firenze.
Really?
Oh, so many years
also
ago.
got.
It was in 81 or something like that. Yeah, they were there. It was a great moment because Therborn was promoting a conception of social movement, and Charles Tilly was having another one.
Yes.
And they